What does the word cult mean?
That no one would ever admit that they were a cult.
No, I mean, it's like asshole.
What does the word cult really mean? Is it just a benign description of a religious group or a derogatory term used to insult new religious movements?
You know, it's just an insult. That's all it is. It's purely and simply an insult.
In this video, I'm going to explore the etymology of the term and explain why I think cults should be thought of in terms of having a big C or a little c. The term cult is persuasive in modern discourse, often invoking images of fringe religious groups or charismatic leaders. Some scholars argue that we should abandon the word cult completely and replace it with phrases like high demand group or new religious movements.
I recognize we're different. I recognize we're a high demand group. I recognize we're a new religious movement.
Meanwhile, other scholars say that cult should not be avoided because it serves as a critical and necessary term to identify and discuss specific patterns of manipulation, coercion and abuse that occurs in certain groups, and that avoiding the term risks obscuring the harm these groups inflict and undermines efforts to educate the public about the dangers. This, however, is not the way the word cult has always been perceived. Its history reveals a nuanced evolution in both meaning and societal attitudes. This is also notable even today in circumstances in which things like a rock band or a personality or even a restaurant chain can be associated with notions of cultic behaviour. People like McKay and Lady Gaga are said to have a cult following. Likewise, Apple users or fans of Star Wars may be considered as cult members, but none of these examples are affiliated with causing adverse harm. Exploring the history of the term cult from Roman times through the medieval period, the Renaissance, scientific revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, and the Victorian era into contemporary usage demonstrates the broader usage that provide a comprehensive overview to this very nuanced term. Starting with Roman times, the origin of the word cult can be traced back to the Latin word cultus, which originates from the verb plough, which I've probably totally mispronounced. Anyway, this word means to till or to cultivate, of tending to land in agriculture. Over time, cultus evolved to encompass broader meanings of care and devotion, extending from physical cultivation of crops to the metaphorical cultivation of religious practices for the divine. The connection between nature and spirituality is deeply rooted in the origins of human culture, where rhythms of the natural world were seen as reflections of divine order. In ancient societies, the act of cultivating land, planting, harvesting, and sustaining life were not merely a practical necessity, but a sacred duty. Recognizing this helps to make sense of why the Latin word cultus embodies the relationship of both the physical act of tending to the earth and the spiritual act of worshipping the gods who were believed to control nature's forces. Agriculture was seen as a partnership between humans and the divine, with rituals and offerings made to ensure favourable weather, fertile soil, and bountiful harvests. Festivals aligned with seasonal cycles, such as planting in spring, reaping in autumn, becoming opportunities for communal celebration and spiritual renewal. This link between nature and spirituality fostered a sense of interconnectedness, where the health of the land was tied to the well-being of the community and the favour of the gods. In summary, cultus came to mean care, adoration, or worship. It did not carry the negative connotations it does today. Instead, it was a neutral term denoting religious practice and devotion. The term cultus was part of the broader Roman religious vocabulary that included things like religio and superstitio. Religio referred to the proper state-sanctioned worship of the gods, while superstitio described excessive or improper worship. Cultus therefore occupied a respectable middle ground, underscoring the societal importance of maintaining piety and proper religious contact. Roman religious life was highly ritualistic, and cultus encompassed the daily and seasonal rituals that maintained the peace of the gods, so to speak, which was essential for the well-being of the state and its people. Roman cultus also extended to the veneration of emperors, which was known as the imperial cult. This practice was a means of consolidating political power and fostering unity across the empire. The imperial cult highlighted the intersection of religion and politics in Roman society, where loyalty to the emperor was both a civic and a religious duty. The reverence for emperors and other deified figures further emphasized the role of cultus in promoting social cohesion and political stability. Moving on to the medieval period, the term cult or cultus retained its religious significance, primarily in the context of veneration of saints. The cults of saints was a widespread phenomenon involving the reverence and worship of saints, again through rituals, relics, and this extended to pilgrimages as well. The term still did not imply any deviance or danger, but rather it was integral to the Christian religious fabric. The veneration of saints served various social and religious functions, providing a means for communities to express their faith, seek divine intercession, and establish local deities through association with particular saints. The legitimacy of these practices was supported by the Church, which promoted the veneration of saints as a way to reinforce orthodoxy and communal religious life. Saints were often regarded as intermediaries between the divine and human realms, capable of performing miracles and providing protection. Relics of saints believed to possess spiritual power became central to medieval worship, attracting pilgrims and fostering economic activity in regions housing specific relics. This period also saw the rise of religious orders and monasteric communities dedicated to particular saints, further embedding the cultus saints into the fabric of medieval life. The medieval period also saw the formation of guilds, which were regulatory groups for trades such as bakers, blacksmiths, bankers, merchants, and artisans. Most towns had regulations requiring workers to join a guild to practice their trade, and each guild was often associated with a patron saint. Essentially, the veneration of saints helped to establish and reinforce social hierarchies, as noble families sought to associate themselves with powerful saints to legitimize their rule. This dynamic underscores how the cultus saints functioned both as a religious and socio-political phenomenon during the medieval period, integrating faith with daily life and governance. Moving on to the Renaissance. The Renaissance period saw the continuation of the religious use of the word, or the equivalent to cult, especially as the venerations of saints and religious figures persisted. However, during this era, we also see the beginning of the humanist movement and the Protestant Reformation, both of which began to challenge the establishment of religious practices, subtly shifting the perception of certain cults as superstitious or excessive. The Reformation in particular criticised what it saw as idolatrous practices associated with the veneration of saints, relics, and images, branding them as remnants of medieval superstition. This period marked the beginning of a more critical stance towards certain religious practices, setting the stage for later negative connotations of the term cult. Humanist scholars of the Renaissance advocated for the return to the original sources of Christianity, promoting a more personal and direct relationship with God that often bypassed the elaborate rituals associated with the cults of the saints. The printing press that was invented around this time facilitated the spread of Reformation ideas, enabling critiques of church practices to reach a wider audience and further erode the traditional authority of established religious institutions like the Holy Roman Catholic Church. During the Renaissance, there was a diversification of religion that led to the veneration of saints being declared improper by some people. The Reformation also led to the fragmentation of Christianity into multiple denominations, each with its own interpretation and practices. This diversification of religious expression highlighted the scrutiny of groups perceived as deviating from the new norms of Protestant orthodoxy. Consequently, the term cult began to carry implications of heresy, reflecting the growing tensions and conflicts within Christianity. Some people, both past and present, consider the Holy Roman Church to be a large cult that sought to control others through coercive means. For example, it banned certain books, under what was called Index Liberatum Prohibitationum, and placed scientists like Galileo under house arrest for challenging the church's authority. The us versus them mentality was prevalent among many fracturing groups, leading to derogatory name-calling. And of course, we can't forget the scientific revolution. With the scientific revolution, the term cult began to subtly shift as scientific inquiry and rationalism started to critique and question traditional religious practices. Cults in this context began to be seen as remnants of an irrational past, though the term was not widely used in a derogatory term just yet. The growing emphasis on empirical evidence and rational thought fostered a skeptical attitude towards practices that could not be scientifically validated. This period also saw the emergence of new scientific societies and intellectual movements that, while not described as cults, exhibited some characteristics of dedicated and exclusive groups centered around shared beliefs and goals. So it was pretty much during the scientific revolution that the term cult began to become derogatory and associated with irrational beliefs. Prominent figures like Rene Descartes and Isaac Newton really embodied the spirit of scientific revolution, challenging traditional views and advocating for a new understanding of the natural world based on observation and experimentation. This intellectual shift also influenced religious thought, leading to the rise of deism, which emphasized rational and natural religion free from the perceived superstition of traditional faiths. The scientific methods emphasized on repeatability and observable phenomena stood as a stark contrast to the mystical and mysterious elements of religious cults. As science progressed, the gap between rational inquiry and religious belief widened, with cults increasingly being seen as relics of a less enlightened era. This period also laid the groundwork for later secular critiques of religious movements that did not align with the principles of reason and empirical evidence. We then had the Age of Enlightenment, which further critiqued perspectives on religious practices that deviated from reason and rationality. The word cult started to be used more pejoratively, indicating a group with irrational beliefs or excessive devotion that stood in opposition to the Enlightenment ideas of reason and logic. Enlightenment thinkers often criticized organized religion and superstitious practices, advocating for a more secular and rational approach to understanding the world. This intellectual climate contributed to the growing suspicion and marginalization of groups perceived as irrational or fanatical, laying the groundwork for the modern understanding of cults. Enlightenment philosophers championed individual freedom, secular governance, and scientific progress, often viewing traditional religious institutions as obstacles to these goals. Their critiques extended to any group or movement that seemed to resist rational inquiry or promote unquestioning devotion. This period saw the rise of secret societies like the Freemasons, which, despite their Enlightenment principles, were sometimes labelled as cults by their detractors due to their secretive nature and distinct rituals. Personally, I think the Freemasons are a cult with a little c. The Enlightenment's emphasis on universal human rights and equality also led to increased scrutiny of religious practices that appeared to undermine these ideals. Movements or sects that demanded absolute loyalty or promoted hierarchical structures were often viewed with suspicion and labelled as cults, reflecting a growing concern with preserving individual autonomy and rational thought. Then, as we moved on to the Victorian era, the term cult began to take on more of its modern connotations. The period's fascination with spiritualism, the occult, and unorthodox religious movements led to growing suspicion and sensationalism around groups deemed to be cults. These groups were often portrayed as deviant and a threat to social norms. The Victorian era was marked by a complex interplay between scientific progress, religious revivalism, and the interest in the mystical and supernatural. It is within this context that heightened scrutiny of groups that deviated from mainstream religious practices began to be associated with the term cult. The rise of spiritualism and the occult during the Victorian period, exemplified by figures such as Helena Blavatsky and the Theological Society, captivated the public's imagination, but also sparked concern among authorities and traditional religious leaders. These movements were often seen as challenging the established social order and promoting beliefs that were at odds with mainstream Christianity. In the Victorian era, cults were basically considered any group that were at odds with mainstream Christianity. Literature and media of the time also played a significant role in shaping public perceptions of cults. Sensationalist accounts of secretive and exotic religious practices, often depicted in novels and newspapers, fueled the public's fascination and fear. This era's portrayal of cults laid the groundwork for the 20th century's more dramatic and often negative representation of these groups. Moving on to the modern era. Today, the word cult is commonly associated with groups that are considered to be extreme or dangerous, often characterized by authoritative leadership, manipulative practices, and deviant beliefs. The term is used in popular culture and academic discourse to describe a wide range of groups, from small religious sects to large organized movements and even multi-level marketing schemes. The shift in meaning reflects broader societal changes and anxieties about religious and ideological conformity. Modern media and literature have played significant roles in shaping public's perception of cults, often focusing on dramatic and sensational aspects. Academic studies have also expanded to examine the psychological and sociological dynamics within cults, contributing to an even more nuanced understanding of their appeal and their impact. So, in a negative sense, cult is often used to describe a group that is extreme or dangerous. High-profile cases like the Jonestown Massacre in 1978 and the Branch Davidian Siege in 1993 have cemented the association of cults with danger and extremism within the public mind. These incidents highlight the potential for manipulation and abuse. So really, I think we're at a point where we need to reevaluate the meaning of the term cult in contemporary usage. In the past, particularly the ancient past, is filled with examples of groups that by today's standards would be considered harmful and unethical. The abuse within past religious groups went unrecognised due to lack of understanding of coercive control, similar to how slavery was once tolerated. As society has collectively challenged and condemned certain cultish behaviours, the term cult has probably rightly gained some very negative connotations. However, it's also important to recognise that the term cult is still used in a benign sense in some circumstances, like the examples I gave earlier, which is kind of in line with ancient times when it just meant devotion. Personally, I don't avoid using the word cult because the general population has a much better understanding of this term than the alternatives like new religious movement or high demand group. I also think these alternative terms muddy the waters quite a bit. For example, David McKay, founder of the Jesus Christians, who is better known in the media as the Kidney Cult, he claims that he's not a cult leader, but he recognises that he runs a high-demand group or new religious movement. Clearly, he does not understand that these terms are just a sanitised way of saying cult. As I explained in some of my other videos, he uses some very deviant, manipulative and coercive practices, like monitoring all the emails of his members.
You know, nobody describes himself as a cult.
Anything from a music band to the McKays of this world can and do attract the word cult, which echoes the term's original usage as simply mean care or worship. However, there is still a need to differentiate between the harmless and the harmful cult leaders. The term cult has become a catch-all phrase in contemporary speech, often used casually to describe any group with a passionate following or shared interest. These groups, bound by a common interest, are generally harmless and can be seen as cults with a little c. Communities that provide a sense of belonging without dark undertones. On the other hand, when we think of cults in the more sinister sense, those with manipulative leaders, exploitative practices, and a pendulum for controlling every aspect of members' lives, we're talking about cults with a big C. These are the dangerous groups led by authoritative figures who use coercion, deceit, and isolation to dominate their followers. The confusion between these two usages can obscure the real dangers posed by destructive cults. By distinguishing between cults with a little c and those with a big C, we can better understand the spectrum of group behaviour and identify when a seemingly benign community crosses the line into harmful territory. To differentiate between a cult with a little c or cult with a big C, we need to understand coercive control. Instead of merely viewing cults as groups that fall outside of standardized religions, they are better viewed as groups that monopolize on extreme interpretations of an ideology to inflict human rights abuses. This perspective helps to separate belief and faith from coercion and control. Moreover, a clear understanding of what constitutes coercive control is needed in order to make a judgment about whether a group is a cult with a little c or a big C. This is where having a robust how to spot a cult system comes into play. By using a set of criteria designed to measure the degree of coercive control present in any group, like the cult ranking that I have devised, groups can be recognised as being either a playful, harmless cult with a little c or a more dangerous, controlling cult with a big C. This system scores groups based on factors like authoritative leadership, control over information, and fear-based tactics, making it easier to spot red flags before it's too late. By applying these criteria, we can better navigate murky waters of group dynamics and safeguard ourselves and others from the destructive grip of coercive control.